Well, good day, everyone, and welcome to the Society for the Anthropology of Consciousness's April 2024 First Friday event. I'm very pleased that we have Sid Greenfield back again. Sid is an emeritus professor from University of Wisconsin and a former president of this very organization. So I first learned about Sid's work through some of his presentations at SAC meetings. And of course, I was quite entranced by the idea of a Brazilian doctor who does surgery using a circular saw, if I remember correctly. That got a lot of attention in the presentation. And Sid has had
that.
and Sid has had a lot of very colorful encounters. So today Sid's going to talk about something very different. He's going to talk about consciousness itself. So I don't know how much of his fieldwork he's going to be weaving in right now, but I will turn the floor over to Sid, and thank you all for attending.
Thank you, John, and thank you for those of you who are here. A little background. In November of 2023, Michael Winkelmann presented a tour de force on the evolution of shamanism. After all this time, I'm still digesting it. Today, I will do something less pretentious that may be considered more functional about consciousness than Michael's evolutionary approach. Consciousness has long been a subject of interest to anthropologists, and much has been written about it by anthropologists, including me and others. After all, there is a section within the AAA on the topic and a journal in which I've also published. But to the best of my knowledge, little, if anything, has been written about the relationship between culture and consciousness, specifically exploring the state of consciousness experienced by the participants in any specific culture and the similarities and differences between the states of consciousness of people who are in different cultures. The normative state assumed by most cultures is that of the culture of modernity and its rationality. Psychologists, who were the first to study consciousness systematically, have written the most about it, seem to take the idea of a single normal state as given, and with it, a single altered state. As Heinrich and others made clear, however, the subjects most psychologists use in their experiments are their university students, and they represent a single culture, that of the modern Western world, even if they come from elsewhere. Studies of consciousness by psychologists are a subcategory of their general research program and are normed on Western culture. Hence, they assume that there is a single normal state of consciousness, and those interested in altered states assume that there is just one. A disclaimer: I am a cultural anthropologist, an ethnographer, and cultural relativist. By the latter, I mean that I operate under the assumption that people socialized in different cultures operate in terms of different premises from each other and views of the world. Hence, from the outset, I have a problem accepting the idea that there is a single normal state and only one altered one. Those anthropologists who assume this, I suggest, do so because they have taken their lead from psychologists. Today, I'm going to approach the study of consciousness and altered states from the perspective of culture and of cultural diversity. The hypothesis I propose is that the members of each culture have their own normal state of consciousness and an altered one that differs from their normal state and differs also from those of other cultures. The framework I will be using is that presented by the late Marshall Solins in his book, The New Science of the Enchanted Universe. And if you haven't read it or seen it, I strongly recommend that you do take a look because it's well worth it. Solins starts with the psychologist philosopher Karl Jasper's notion of the axial age, of which Max Weber's opposition between enchantment and disenchantment is a later iteration. Solins makes explicit the idea that the culture of modernity, whose assumptions are implicit in psychology, anthropology, and all science, non-material beings are believed to be in another domain and neither appear nor have agency in the one we inhabit. In his words, quote, "In an enchanted universe, the natural supernatural distinction becomes meaningless. Many of its denizens are not only the all-pervasive unseen agents of the events in this world, they often make themselves visible in phenomenal forms in all kinds of ways. But then humans are spirits too, composed of a physical body activated by an invisible soul. Human persons are the same in constitution as embodied metapersons. By their own unseen powers, people are able to interact socially with the spirits, in dreams most commonly, where the interlocutors of human dreamers are as real as they are. By the same metaphysical powers, people, not only shamans, but ordinary people, have been known to visit and live with spirit people in their homelands underwater, under the earth, or in the sky," unquote. In our modern world, we create institutions that determine our lives and futures. In the enchanted worlds that existed previously, and some places today, humans shared their world with what we take to be otherworldly beings, including at times the ancestors of the living. Solon sees the idea of transcendence as the common theme in all pre-modern cultures. That is, the meta-beings, including the ancestors, transcend what we take to be the division between two separate domains. These other cultures accept and live in terms of the idea that meta-persons, including their ancestors, share their world and have agency in it, and hence may determine the life chances of individuals. Solins provides numerous examples, mostly from classic ethnographies. I'll offer some of my own. The first example of a distinct culture and both the normal and altered states of consciousness of its participants is the Kofan people of the Ecuadorian Amazon. As Michael Sepik, who has been doing research with the Kofan for some 3 decades, as he puts it, he is not studying, but rather learning from them, specifically learning to become a shaman from Cesario, one of their better respected ones. Thus far, he has reported on the Kofan system of knowledge or ontology as he is learning it from Cesario. Sepik begins his account by informing us that Cesario starts his shamanic activities by taking agé, or ayahuasca, a hallucinogenic drug. He keeps taking it until he can, quote, see, hear, or experience the beings in the other world that are believed to have efficacy in the lives of the members of his society. In the terms I am using, this translates into him entering an altered state of consciousness that is different from the one he was in before taking the ayahuasca. In the altered state, he can see, hear, and experience the spirits of the plants and animals his people depend on, for example, to induce them to reproduce and become more available. Nature and culture, as we see them, merge into one dimension. Cesario also can see, hear, and experience his people's enemies, those who make them sick, explaining the Kofan view of illness. He visualizes the things his people's enemies place in their bodies that are the cause of their illnesses. Cesario can cure them if he removes the items in time. In this sense, Cesario is a healer. He also is a protector and defender of his people against the shaman of their enemies who are attacking them. In the name of protecting his people at times, he must kill the ritual leaders doing the attacking before they assault the Kofan. This state of warfare between Cesario's people and their enemies, the Quichua, or between their respective ritual leaders, has intensified since the 1960s, when the Quichua began to move into the Kofan's territory because Euro-Ecuadorian settlers forced them from their traditional homelands. Kofan shaman in an altered state, therefore, can see their not necessarily materially present enemies. Ordinary people cannot, but they know they and the world of metapersons are there. Only when they also drink enough ayahuasca may they see what a shaman can. While unlike the shaman, they have not learned to act in response to what they see. But by perceiving what the shaman does, they share with their ritual leaders a world that differs from that of other people, such as us, for example. Consequently, members of Kofan society share a distinctive culture, and when one of them, usually one of their ritual leaders, goes into an altered state, they are in a cognitive world different from the one we might be in should we enter an altered state. The Kofan then provide us with an example of a people who live in a cultural world with a distinctive ordinary state of consciousness that differs from the one their ritual leaders are in when they enter an altered one. The second example I'll present is the Lakota Sioux, a North American First Nation whose ancestors roamed the Great Plains. I have been learning about them because my friend and colleague, Father Reno Bonvini, and I have been using the epistemology and spiritually infused worldview that is helping them recover from the devastation imposed on them when the Euro-Americans attacked and then dispossessed them from their traditional homelands to help the Pitiguari, an indigenous Brazilian group, to reconstitute themselves and recover from what has happened to them in the hands of Brazilian settler society. The contemporary Lakota, who lost much of their traditional culture following the massacre at Wounded Knee, when the US military slaughtered men, women, and children and placed them on reservations, were able to relearn much of what they lost, primarily from a book called, quote, Big Elk Speaks, in which the venerable Nick Big Elk told writer John Neihardt about their traditional beliefs and ritual practices. In the 1960s, having read the book and wanting to learn more about their past, a group that was part of the American Indian movement went to the Lakota Reservation in South Dakota and spoke with some of those who had been present when Nick Big Elk dictated his message. Their efforts and the movement in general led Native peoples across North America, including the Lakota, to reconstitute in modified form the ritual practices of their ancestors. When Father Reno learned from his adopted brother, medicine man Adam Little Elk, was the intentional effort of the Lakota people to reinterpret what Big Elk told them with its integrative message. The revived rituals are performed annually as part of the sun dance in which most tribal members participate. The Lakota do not use hallucinogens to enter an altered state. Instead, they achieve a similar result by fasting for 4 days, the 4 days duration of a sun dance, during which they enter the sweat lodge where they pray intensely that they will receive a vision. While performing their daily activities, the Lakota, especially the many who live in urban areas, share the same culture and state of consciousness as other Americans. That state differs from the Kofan, many of whom are gradually coming to share the ordinary state of mainstream modern Ecuadorians. During a sun dance, when they pray for a vision in the sweat lodge, the Lakota who enter an altered state are in one that differs from their ordinary state and from that of Kofan ritual leaders when they enter an ayahuasca-induced altered state. I recently participated in a sweat lodge ritual with the Pitiguari, an indigenous Brazilian people on their reservation in Maracanã in the northeastern state of Ceará. Several years ago, Adam Little Elk visited his adopted brother, Father Reno, and helped the Pitiguari construct the sweat lodge. When a young indigenous man emerged from the ritual, he told me that he had experienced the presence of a deceased Pache, one of their rituals, who sang a traditional song in Tupi-Guarani, their traditional language, which they no longer speak. Neto Pitiguari, who when he works for an agency of the state of Ceará, is in the same state of consciousness as most other modern Brazilians. He was in a different one when he had a vision in the sweat lodge. Another example comes from my research into Afro-Brazilian religious traditions. Most practitioners of candomblé, for example, participate in the same culture as other Brazilians and share their normal state of consciousness. When they engage in rituals, pray, and enter an altered state, they are an enchanted world also occupied by many West African deities, some who are ancestors, not less necessarily theirs, but the remote ones of their predecessors who were brought as slaves to Brazil from Africa. During a required ritual initiation, each initiate learns about these deities, especially the ones that are their personal spiritual advisors, referred to as the owners of their head. In return for helping an initiate with daily decisions, the individual is obligated to care for and propitiate their personal supernatural beings by providing food and performing specific rituals. Needless to say, a practitioner of candomblé, when in the enchanted world of the deities, is not in the same state of consciousness as a Kofan shaman or a Lakota ritual leader in a sweat lodge. Umbanda is customarily considered another Afro-Brazilian religion. From the perspective I am using, however, it is quintessentially Brazilian. When an Umbanda initiate whirls and gyrates to the sound of drums and enters an altered state, she is entering an enchanted world filled not with African meta-beings as in candomblé, but rather with entities representing stereotypes taken from Brazilian history. These include pretos velhos, former slaves who continue to help Brazilians today, caboclos, assimilated Indians, malandros, a type of distinctively Brazilian con man, and other mythical beings who through mediums help those who seek their assistance. While performing their daily activities, Umbandistas are in the same state of consciousness as candombleros and other Brazilians. When incorporating one of the religion's mythical beings, however, they are not in the same state of consciousness as the practitioners of candomblé, a Kofan shaman, or a Lakota Sioux ritual. The final example, I have to mention this, is taken from my studies of Brazilian cognitive spiritism, specifically of the surgeries performed by healer mediums who operate, actually cut, as John mentioned, with anything from a rusty knife to a scalpel to an electrical saw in unsterilized settings and without the patients being anesthetized. The belief is that it is not the medium who performs the surgery, but rather spirits from another domain who temporarily occupy the material bodies of the medium, bringing with them the anesthesia, antisepsis, and all else needed for the care of the patient. Both the medium and the patients are in an altered state, one to receive the spirit who does the surgery, and the other who, while treated, responds to suggestions or learned expectations. When they do, immediate early genes are released and other bodily processes are stimulated, activating the patient's immune, endocrine, and other biophysiological systems. Patients not only may feel little or no pain, even when cut into, their biophysiological processes can fight off infections or other complications, leading to recovery. With respect to my theme, when Cartesian mediums and others present at their sessions enter an altered state, they are in a distinctive enchanted universe inhabited by all of those presently alive or incarnate or who previously occupied their world. Cartesians believe that the deceased or their spirits occupy a domain separate from our material world. Believing in reincarnation, the spirits of all those alive at any point in time have lived previously, disincarnated and reincarnated, usually multiple times over the eons. They further believe that the living and the spirits of the dead can communicate, and on occasion, the currently dead may enter our world, as when spirits of deceased doctors enter and use the bodies of mediums to perform surgery, or when the spirits of the living are transported to the spirit world and treated by healers there. What is important for my argument is that Brazilian cardiacists are in the same state of consciousness as other Brazilians until they enter an altered one. The mediums whose bodies are being used, for example, are in a state that is different from that of Candomblé initiates, Umbanda practitioners, Lakota worshippers, and Kofan ritual leaders. I can add to this the evangelical Protestants I have studied, who may be Brazilian or North Americans ordinarily, but when they enter an altered state during religious rituals, receive Jesus Christ and the Holy Spirit. When they do, they are in a different state than are all of the other groups. If there are multiple ordinary states of consciousness and many altered ones, the next question is, how can we explain how this happens? How do individuals in different cultures learn to function in both a distinct ordinary state and then, when induced in one of a variety of ways, in a distinctive altered one? The answer I suggest is in the way the brain processes information. Reality for all living things, including humans, consists of events that take place in the world around them. People are aware, however, or conscious of only a small portion of what is a continuous flow of information from the world outside them that they process and use to think about and make decisions about the issues of relevance to them. This small part of all we are exposed to is what becomes the specific reality of those in each place and time. As Norstranders, quoted in Zimmerman, observed almost 4 decades ago, quote, "What we perceive at any moment is limited to an extremely small compartment of the stream of information about our surroundings flowing in from the sense organs," unquote. Zimmerman elaborates, writing, "The maximum information flow of the process of conscious sensory perception is about 40 bits per second, many orders of magnitude below that taken in by the receptors, the nerve endings. Our perception, then, would appear to be limited to a minute part of the abundance of information available as sensory input," unquote. Of the millions of bits of information that flood through the human senses every single second, Zimmerman estimates some 10 million bits per second enter through the eyes, another million through the skin, 100,000 each through the ears and nose, and still another 1,000 through the taste buds. Of these more than 11 million bits of information per second that human beings have the potential to be conscious of, they are aware of at most approximately 40 bits. Which 40 bits? A selection process is necessary to avoid overflow or placing an individual in a position of being unable to respond, which would happen if flooded with the excessive amount of information to which they are exposed. While most of the information is carried to the lower parts of the brain, from where neurons carry them to direct physiological responses of internal body organs like the respiratory, digestive, and circulatory systems, and from the midbrain to direct wakefulness, sleeping, and responses to danger, such as fight or flight. But the 40 bits per second of interest to me are carried to the prefrontal cortex, where language is located and reasoning take place. It is here that humans are able to formulate internal representations of external events that can be stored in memories and then retrieved in thinking, deliberating, reasoning, reminiscing, planning, making decisions, and interacting with others by being able to anticipate to a degree responses that ethnographers call their normative culture. Through language, they may discuss issues and debate differences. But this raises another question. Which 40 of the millions of bits per second enter the brains of specific humans? Or do the same 40 bits per second enter the brains of a Kofan religious leader when in an altered state and a Lakota in trance? I suggest not. The internal representations of each differs as they do from Brazilian Umbandistas and Kardecists when they enter an altered state. What is needed is something like a filter that separates out the information that is not relevant to the group. Cognitive scientists refer to this as the information needed to form patterns. If not, as Patricia Alexander writes, quote, the ability to discern meaningful patterns in a stream of data that continually floods the senses, humans would remain prisoners within a world of isolated sights, smells, and sounds, unable to comprehend or to build on experience across time and space, unquote. My point is that the 40 bits per second of information that make human cognition and consciousness possible differ from one group to another. What I am suggesting is that each culture, or the members thereof, has its own distinctive conscious awareness of what reality is. That is formed by the fraction of information that is carried from their sense receptors to their brains, and they think, reason, and behave in terms of it. Their behaviors are the normative patterns we seek to observe and describe when we do ethnography. We have seen them in the examples presented. Kofan culture, as described by Sipik, is not the same as the culture of contemporary Lakota Sioux, who in a normal state share a version of that of the US. But when a Kofan shaman consumes sufficient ayahuasca and sees, hears, and experiences a reality that differs from what he experiences ordinarily, he is using 40 bits of information that differs from the 40 bits he uses when in a normal state. And the same is true for the members of other cultures. The information an individual is conscious of in a normal state and uses to think, reason, and make decisions differs from what they use when they are in an altered state. And that information differs from members of other cultures. In the many pre-modern enchanted cultures humans lived in since culture first appeared, and in those that have survived, the 40 bits of information per second individuals are consciously aware of in an altered state includes information that activates memories about the meta-beings, spirits incarnatism, Kofun enemy shaman inflicting illness on people, and Lakota and Candomblé ancestors who interact with the living, helping to guide people's life choices. From the vast amount of information the sense receptors of humans in different cultures take in from the outside world, the infinitesimal amounts their brain use to store memories and use in normal states differs from one group to another. When they enter an altered state, yet another minuscule amount orients how they behave. To conclude then, each of the many cultures has its own ordinary and a different altered state of consciousness based on the specific infinitely small amount of information from the outside world that flows from the senses of its participants to their brains and guides their behavior. Thank you.
Thank you.
Ron, you're muted.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Sid, for your contributions. And I would like to open up the floor to any questions or comments there might be. There was a lot to unpack that was just said. Anybody out there?
Yeah, I have a question, but I'm just orienting myself in my house so I can get to my question. So I'll have to kind of read it. Just out of curiosity, and I missed the first 10 minutes, so I apologize if there's anything. Sorry, I'm just trying to find my question because it resulted. It's something, so I was talking with somebody else. So I'm working with a student at Goddard College who is working on ideas of consciousness and neurodiversity. And one of her, I guess you'd say one of her main theories is that neurodiversity and autism specifically, rather than being a condition grounded in an inability to connect, which is kind of the current medical theory, that it's primarily a sensory disorder that creates too much connection and thus overwhelm. So it's a different kind of a state of consciousness. So I was curious if in your research, looking at different states of consciousness, if some of the cultural consciousnesses are then sort of split up into different neuro sensory, individual neuro, what to say, fingerprints, let's put it that way. Does that question make sense?
Yeah, well, what I would suggest here is that maybe in autism, the filter I talked about that enables the individual to select the relevant 40 bits for their culture, what it does, the filters don't work, and they are overloaded with information. And as a result, this leads to the kind of what we refer to as non-normative behavior that is psychologically diagnosed as autism. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, that's very interesting. In fact, one of my comments to her was that she might read Aldous Huxley's Doors of Perception, where he talks about the filtering system and how different states of consciousness kind of have different sizes of weaves in that filter, in that net. So yes, thank you. That's very interesting.
Yeah, well, you can pass it on to him, maybe.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you have any, would you have any resources or recommendations in terms of books or articles that would be interesting to her?
Let's see. What I would suggest is this Joseph Ledoux book on consciousness. And later on, if you send me an email, I could send you the reference.
Okay, great.
Other comments? So if I remember correctly, Hillary brought up Aldous Huxley, and he used the term reducing valve, normal consciousness as a reducing valve, that if we didn't have it in place, we would be overwhelmed. And he was using that in conjunction with his discussions of mescaline experiences, in which he was talking about that reducing valve having been basically blown wide open. So I've been curious about these kind of things too, because when I was studying the nervous system, I was struck by the fact, or I learned that what the nervous system is constantly doing is, as information is coming in from the senses and coming up into unconscious and conscious awareness, is that it's information's being bundled. And so that like, for example, the thousands of neuroreceptors that are in my right big toe right now are each producing their own signal, but as it comes up to the brain, it has to be compiled into something manageable, which means there's both information lost, but also, how can I say, acuity in a certain sense gained. So, Sid, do you see some of these other altered states from different societies as maybe some of them allowing in 50 bits, or some of them reducing it down to 30 bits, or do you see?
No, John, I mean, you know, some of it is going to operate the biophysiological functions.
Right.
It's only this tiny amount, which I think, from what I have read, comes down to 40 bits per second of all of this is what we are conscious of. And again, that's, I would argue, is the basis of culture. When humans develop the ability to form memories and patterns of perceived events that they could recognize, including linguistic signs, you know, what we hear, the noises that we hear, that we are able to process into meaningful language. Again, this is a very tiny fragment of all of the noises, and I probably could have started using language and said, well, it's obvious that languages differ from one culture to another. And it's still, it's that this tiny bit of information that we wind up using that becomes the basis of all that we do. And again, the point I was trying to make was the very simple one of acknowledging the diversity in normal states and altered states, which I say, I'm not familiar with the Huxley material, but I found little else that touches on this subject. So this is why it interested me.
Hillary Webb. My name is TOUSS on the screen, and I would urge your student to consider looking in Western ancient. I work a lot with pre-Aristotelian views, and I am fascinated by the fact that we have Mr. Greenfield, you're talking about language. I think it is important, equally important, to consider that language is constructed of literal interpretations as well as metaphorical ones. And there are scholars, philologists, who have concretely established that we have essentially gone into our Western language system of symbolic lore and translated those symbols into literal text, dumbed it down. And when you're talking about, Mr. Greenfield, for example, streams of consciousness and cycles in history, that is a metaphorical analogy, reincarnation, that has been perhaps used to discuss this supra ability of what I would argue and what I would support your student to consider are basically two kinds of brain types. And instead of assuming that autism is a negative kind of brain, Those ancient guys didn't think that way. They recognized them as two symbiotic ways of thinking, and they used them as a tool. It's also, I think, equally important that she might consider ways that we have almost lost sense of the idea that there is, in fact, a difference between egocentrism and altruism. I find that amazing. So all of these things they've been erased from our cultural memory. And it's a very complicated problem. There is a woman by the name of Heather White who opened my eyes up in terms of this whole issue of, the way we have changed our language system. I'm in the arts. I work with symbolic language system, and I see the same thing has happened there. And in fact, there is a woman by the name of Holly, I don't remember her first name, but she argues that all of the crises in art come down to the fact that we've eradicated the ancient feminine, and she is correct. But amazingly, she didn't go far enough back, like I'm urging your student to do. We cannot assume that everything that we have been taught in Aristotelian science is absolutely objective and didn't have anything to do with, tensions between those two kinds of brain types. So I find your subject very, very fascinating. Thank you for listening.
Sorry, could you say again what resources you were, was there?
I work a lot with I started out with ancient medical manuscripts. I got fascinated in what we are now in this lecture calling shamanism, but of course back then they called it Asclepian medicine, Asclepios, Greek. I work a lot with Greek, and that branches out into other, Roman and Egyptian and all of that stuff. But most of what I work with is ancient medicine, and they did not even think of what you're talking about, all of this consciousness. It's essentially, in my opinion, it's being looked at as a product. I'm more conscious, I'm more able to be to experience multiple forms of consciousness than you are. That's all egocentrical stuff. But they had strict ways of harvesting consciousness so that it was a symbiotic composite of analysis as opposed to intuition and prophecy and all of that. So, again, it is an extremely complicated problem. I would urge you to start out with Pythagorism, for example. That guy's really, really smart. That's enough for me now.
No, we thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yes, sir. I love it a lot.
Thanks.
Now, just a comment. I will let Hillary respond to that in a moment, but just the whole notion of studying ancient pre-Socratic symbolic systems is as important as diverse cultures. And I think it would be kind of interesting if we can ever get, for example, people who study indigenous Amazonian groups, and I'm part of one of those groups, together with the prehistorians to discuss things like healing. There would be a fascinating outcome. And my hypothesis goes back to my work on Kardecist Spiritist healing, that very significant in this becomes the ability to activate biophysiological systems in a highly diverse series of ways. But Hillary, you may want to comment.
Not so much. I guess I would just say that I like the idea of going backward as far as possible, because of course we always, when we're assuming what is quote unquote normal, and normal tends to be the thing against which all our research is dependent, unfortunately, is our current assumption of normal. let's keep going back and seeing what different assumptions of normal, quote unquote, have been over the centuries and millennia, and yeah, and what other theories there were, because sometimes they change, not due necessarily to learning, but to trends and to political agendas and whatever. So yeah, I think wonderful history of consciousness is incredibly interesting.
But this goes back, if I may, this goes back to psychologists dominating what we think about in terms of research and what is normal. And it comes very much, and it raises the question of the need that anthropologists have believed in going back a very long time, that we essentially need a psychology from each culture as we need a linguistics and a science coming from each culture. I went back and recently, if you're not familiar with it, read the very old article by Sapir and Worth about the relationship between culture and language, and I would recommend it to you, amongst other things.
I read an article a few years ago, but unfortunately, Hillary, I can't give you any information about it, but it was quite eye-opening in the sense that I think they were making the point that the spectrum, not necessarily like hardcore autism, but people on the Asperger's side of the spectrum, for example, may have had their first archaeological evidence showing up during the time of Homo erectus, because the argument was being made that, in contrast to people like me, I would be, they say, a good hunter because I'm like ADD. So, right, as long as I can stand still, I'm going to pick up all this information from the environment that could be useful. But someone who is more focused and perhaps able to tune out the environment, like many people who have Asperger's are reputed to do, become engineers and mathematicians and such, that would have been the kind of person who could have had the patience to invent something like a hand axe with all multiple steps needed and the hours and hours of work. Whereas to me, I probably would still have been happy with an old school scraper. And so it gives idea to this, or gives a notion to this idea that cognitive diversity or neurodiversity is something that in the course of humankind has been something that has actually enriched our evolution as people have become kind of maybe more specialized to particular types of tasks. I don't know if that's what your student could use, but
yeah, no, I think that's so fascinating, and it's been wonderful talking to her. And just one reflection that I found fascinating was her experience, her understanding. She doesn't tend to hold on to things like, there are those of us who can still be thinking about an argument we had 20 years ago and being mad about it. She does not hold on to that kind of thing, which to me is the definition of sanity, as opposed to still arguing with your third grade teacher from however many years ago. So I like that idea, and I wish it would take hold in the culture more, of the absolute need for the multiplicity of neurological types and the superpowers that come with each. Because it's what would we, because in some ways, like I said, I feel like in some ways she's more sane than I am. I mean, not that insane is on the table, but she's more equipped for the world than I am in some ways.
it sounds like a natural born Buddhist.
Totally.
Yeah.
Right, but then on the other hand, what you're saying, Hillary Webb, that is correct, and I think that might be part of the problem, is that what they used to call melancholia, for example, they are now calling bipolar, and there are genetic historians and workers who are very proud of the fact that they've almost eliminated the bipolar gene, because they're trying to determine if it's culturally productive. And as they do that, if they do that, those attributes that used to be so heavily worshipped and appreciated are being eliminated. And those were the ones that connected us with whatever they called God. So basically, we've turned ourselves into a human-run civilization. So it might not be that we are more able to appreciate the differences between the brain types. It might be that we are, in fact, quite intolerant of those variances. Like who is God best? Who does God like best, and who is he most dependent upon? Kind of stuff. I find that, again, to be that might be something that your student might be interested in looking at.
That's great. Thank you.
Thank you for allowing me to interject.
No, this is a classic example of what happens when we can get insights from a different perspective. You know, even those of us who are anthropologists who are trained to think cross-culturally, oftentimes stay in the bubble of our discipline. So to have someone coming from a different perspective is very enriching, I think, for us.
It's also very hard because, I mean, I cannot comprehend. I honestly, I don't know how to present data that is so full of so many contradictions. Everywhere you look, it contradicts stuff. It's very stressful. And I don't want to get into that, but Mr. Greenfield, I will say that you might look up Mbari, M-B-A-R-I. That is ancient Nigerian. The first year when I went back to school, I had a very young baby and I needed to go back to school. And I went into Nigerian because I thought that I'd been in the visual arts and I didn't want to mess with art history. I hated it. So I went in Nigeria because there was a new teacher. And I fell in love with Mbari. At the end of that year, I was failed because I had become very interested in Mbari, which is their medical healing shrines. And that was the first Africanist in the department where I was. It wasn't well received. So I started over in Western, and that is how I ended up with ancient medical manuscripts in Greek. But to make a long story short, that Mbari is very, very important because if you could connect, you can connect. I know that there are connections between the acculturated Brazilian and that Mbari African Nigerian. I know there are, but you have to be careful because the way that they have been interpreted in the last, let's say, 30 years or so, you know, with all of the changes in our culture, they're kind of editing out some of the things that you might find most important.
Yeah, well, this goes back to a broader issue that so much of the traditional cultures that I was talking about, that I go back to Marshall Solon's usage of that, at least in this paper, are being changed through what we used to call an assimilationist process that in this area, to a very considerable degree, is being led by the evangelical churches, which are, this is true in both Brazil and Nigeria, which are treating these traditional cultures as the work of the devil that have to be stamped out. And we're losing an awful lot of our knowledge and understanding and ability to do research.
I think that you are tolerant of recognizing that. A tragedy, in my opinion, is that we are so intolerant of recognizing the same thing that has happened in Western. That's why I said pre-Aristotelian. There's a lot going on there, lots going on there. We don't even, it's out of our cultural memory. But you're right. I think you're very right.
Well, again, the whole idea that our culture, like every other culture, is ethnocentric in the way it views anything that's different. And only we have had much more in terms of material ability to impose our culture on the rest of the world.
Yes.
Destroying everything that is our own past, at least in terms of pre-Aristotle and what you're talking about is pre-Socratic traditions,
No, I'm talking more specifically about Plato and Pythagoras. They were leaders as opposed to Aristotle. There is a lot going on in there. Forgive me for interrupting.
No, you're right. You're right. There's a lot more going on. But, you know, we have depended on Aristotle.
Absolutely. Yes.
That's our notion of the past. Yeah.
Well, one could make the argument too that, you know, we can have this discussion right now because of written records. There could very well have been a Pythagoras and a Plato in many of these other traditional societies whose ideas were lost and changed and rejected over time, but those people might not have the ability to access or remember that in contrast to what we do. I think the tragedy is that we think our history is something that we should just sweep into the dustbin rather than something that we should occasionally look around for the treasures that are still there.
Yeah.
We do as academics, we hope somebody listens to us. So
I have a big question.
Okay. Put your hand up. Okay.
Sorry, did somebody else want to go first? I've been.
I think Lauren Otero.
My name is Rodolfo. Yeah, and sorry, but Hillary, if you want to go first, go ahead.
You go. I've already yapped a bit.
All right. So Sidney, correct me if I'm wrong, but in a way, what you're stating is that there's different realities in a way or different perceived realities for each different culture, and therefore there are different normal states of consciousness as well as different altered state of consciousness for each culture. And I have an anecdote to share. When I was doing my studies in Mexico, at a certain point, my mother, who in a way was a very strict skeptic Westerner, visited me there, and we were living in the house of a healer. So we had the chance to be exposed to the way in which this healer, through altered state of consciousness, possession, as I interpreted that, she was treating people that came with a variety of ailments. At times there were physical ailments as well as many emotional issues. And at the end, when we were driving back to LA, my mother told me, listen, I have a confession. After quite a while, 2 weeks of being there, she told me, listen, I have to make a confession. She said, I don't understand and I don't believe the experiences that they claim, they were having. However, I think that this particular healer, her name was Lucy, she's as good a therapist as any psychologist I have ever been to. So that is you understand, in spite of the fact that their forms of normal consciousness as well as altered state of consciousness were not understood by my mother, she realized that for her people, for the people of this healer, that healer provided with the adequate forms of treatment, just as adequate as our form of treatments are for people here. So in a way, the idea is, I completely agree with you, and I always talk actually to my students about how realities are perceived always through the lens of a culture, and there's no, I really believe that there's no raw reality that is understood by us members of cultures. We all have different ones, and therefore our understandings of normal states of consciousness, altered state of consciousness, and so on, they really vary tremendously. However, one thing that I wanted to observe is when you were mentioning the group from Ecuador and so on, that's a common a very common idea in lowland groups in South America.
Yes,
That that illness, in a way, results from the intrusion either of spirit darts or spirit entities sent by, enemy shamans from another group and so on. Now, and it's all the way from the tip of South America, Tierra del Fuego, the Chilean archipelago, all the way to the Isthmus of Panama. Now, there's that same idea in lowland South America of how illnesses, take place and how they are to be addressed. Yes, by utilizing certain, usually certain substances in order to achieve that altered state of consciousness, and in that way be able to view what's going on and extract it or whatever. No, I remember the one who taught me that. I was a return student. Was Johannes Wilbert.
yeah.
From UCLA.
Right.
Yeah, and that's something which we usually discussed. Thanks for letting me.
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
again, your point that there is a pattern that the Kofan are representative of a much broader New World pattern is certainly true and important to understand, and how this works. But what struck me in terms of what you said earlier was that anthropology has been trying very hard for many, many years to convince psychiatrists and also medical people that understanding the culture of the people they are treating is very important in the treatment. And it started with Arthur Kleinman saying to the medical students that he taught at Harvard, you just have to shut up and listen to them and let them express in their own way what the problems they are perceiving, and this will take us a long way to curing them. But very few psychologists and very few psychiatrists and very few medical people do this. And I think back of a group that I was part of in Brazil that was important in anthropology for an important period of time called ethnopsychiatry. And this was trying to adapt psychiatry to specific cultures.
Mhm.
And I know from my own field work how very successful it was for some of the people that I knew who were doing psychiatry in Northeast Brazil. But, this goes back to the general ethnocentrism of science and knowledge in the Western world, and how culture bound it is, and how we as anthropologists from different perspectives pick up on pieces of this and are trying very hard to get beyond it. I mean, for example, again, I'm feeling like a stream of consciousness, but we have a subgroup within the anthropology of medicine that is trying to introduce teaching anthropology into medical school programs for this very purpose. And again, these are all uphill battles that we sit as amongst the few academics with a cross-cultural experience and say, hey, we have learned something that affects what you people are doing. Please listen to us. But that's part of the problem. We have another question.
I see a Hillary hand.
Hillary? We
Yes.
can't see if you're.
Yep, there we go. So you kind of touched on the question. This is sort of a question for everybody, as anthropologists of consciousness. What tricks or methods or whatever can be useful to study the perceptions of consciousness of another culture in a way that we can get away from our own assumptions as much as possible? I mean, I tend to, at least on behalf maybe even of our readers, like, for example, I tend to gravitate toward autoethnography because at least then I can say, look, I am this kind of person coming from this particular background with this set of assumptions that I've grown up with. So now you know where I'm coming from and what my limitations might be as I'm entering into this culture. But it's always feels a little frustrating trying to understand the psychology or philosophy of consciousness of another culture when I'm entrenched in my own and therefore can never fully understand it to the degree that I want to. So I'm curious what you all have used to kind of get beyond your own assumptions in the field work and in writing.
I'll just take the lead on and say, this is what I was trained to do. This is what being an ethnographer meant to me in terms of the training I got going back to Margaret Mead. What you have to do is get out of yourself. Now, this is very difficult to do, but this is the object of it all, whether it's doing prehistory or it's doing comparative cultures. And this is what we're supposed to be doing. Let others join in.
I think one very important thing, stressed all the way back to Boaz and before, is to become as competent as possible in that other language.
Right.
And to learn to, conceptualize and to speak about the world through the terms of the others that you are studying. And that's, ultimately, it's impossible for me to even understand any of you completely, even though we come from similar cultural backgrounds, speak the same language. So by extension, that's going to apply whether we're looking back in prehistory or across cultures. But we can build bridges and we can get close and we can make approximations. And I think language is a really, really important thing for doing that.
And if I may just jump in and go back to Marshall Solins, one of the arguments in that book is that we have to respect these other cultures and what they believe. And far too often, he argues, particularly in the area of what we categorize as religion, anthropologists have sort of said, after they describe it, say, well, yes, this is really superstition.
That goes all the way back to...
I'm going to be giving another talk in 2 weeks where I'm going to apologize for my own doing of this and say, well, when you learn something from people that you do research with and they tell it to you, damn it, believe them. That's what they believe. It's not superstition, it's their world. And by us judging it, we become ethnocentric, which is something we should be trained to avoid.
But it's also true, here I am, TOUSS again, that when you go back into those early ancient medical manuscripts, I find a lot of stuff in medical and also religious manuscripts. When you go back and you start revising some of the literal interpretations of things and putting 2 and 2 together a lot, I have found that it's remarkable. There is almost like it's an alternative language system, at least in the visual arts and also in text, that is science-based and very, very practical and literal. The problem is, again, as I stated earlier, that we have misinterpreted it by outthinking ourselves or assuming that it's what one of the people in this group referred to as folk. Well, I call that folk. And I think that that folk, what's so important to me about folk language is that it is based upon very practical observations of scientific fact. However, they were very, very good, gifted with allegorically connected like bodies of data. And so they're not just talking sentences, they're talking points in history, and we've just dumbed it down. So I think that the folk and what you're saying, we have to trust them. Well, if we could go back and look at the fact that those simple statements that we assume are just superstitious are in fact literal, we've been grossly misinterpreting them. I think we could begin to recreate that language system. I think that would be a good thing if I am trying to think about how to do that. It's important. And I think that the answers are in the arts, number one, in the visual arts, because our language system, we've completely transformed it. As I said, Heather White, this woman that I thought was so great, she very clearly, all of her books, they talk about how we've changed it. But if you look at the arts, yes, we've muddled all of those symbols, but they're still there. And so all we have to do is learn how to reinterpret what we see in front of us and accept it. And then perhaps we could begin to find some answers. I think you're very right about some of the things that you've said, Mr. Greenfield. Thank you very much for sharing today. It got me off. I've never even talked before, so I talked today.
Good.
That's excellent. I do need to be a little bit of a reality checker and point out that our time is very close to an end. So I would like to just ask all of you present, is there anything you'd like to say as wrap up, or anything you'd like to share in brief terms so we can make sure we get out of here more or less on time? Anyone?
Maybe me. I'm sorry, Hillary.
Too fast.
Yeah, okay. Just an association about the alternative perception of reality, about shamanism and different way of thinking. It was an association in Christianity about the possession, about exorcism, even in such a conservative version of Christianity as Catholicism is. It takes place, and it's looks as a part of, for me at least, as a part of an ancient kind of belief system. Because in some places, for example, in Lithuania, we have exorcists officially, in Poland as well. But for example, as I know, in France, they do not have any. So that's interesting that even in the same Western culture, even in the conservative Christianity, there are kind of differentiations, and these exorcists are working as therapists, for those people who are obsessed, or they see different reality, they are living in different reality, we could say, from common believer, let's say, and they need help. And so it's just my thoughts. It's not a question. Thank you very much for your presentation. It's a good end of the day, of a long day for me.
Thank you.
Okay, we have Hillary's hand up and Rodolfo's hand.
I'll be super quick. I just want to say thank you for Sid, for your words. This is so fascinating. John, thank you for setting these meetings up. I really value this discussion so much, and I love talking about methodology and how to do what we do better or in different ways. So I'm incredibly grateful for this opportunity. So thank you.
Rodolfo?
Yeah, what I would like to say is that with regard to how to better understand other cultures, how to better conduct ethnography, for example. I knew from the get-go. I was in Mexico City, we were visiting healers, we were visiting temples where healings were taking place. I was just going with my regular attire without any problems, mainly worried about the neighborhoods we were going to. I was with a Mexican anthropologist. One of them was Silvia Ortiz Echaniz. I don't know if you ever heard of her. And they were dressed with, they were bringing certain particular amulets and things like that because they were insiders of the culture. Their consciousness, their awareness of the basic reality was one that went along, you see, with the consciousness of the people, of the healers themselves, and so on. I was totally an outsider, and as much as I tried for
Well,
16
this makes
months,
you,
I
this
couldn't be.
makes you the outsider, and they, because they live there, can become insiders to a very considerable degree. You remind me, I should have worn the amulet that the young Pitaguari gave me in Brazil, but I forgot it today.
Yeah, the best idea, or the best thing would be to achieve a great ethnographic work is, I think, it would be to really collaborate, you know, directly, intensively with,
Yeah.
well, you know, professional locals from the culture who share, you know, those ideas. And
Well, this goes back to what I said earlier about the Kofan that we talked about, where Michael Sipik says he's learning from them. He defers to them, and whatever he writes as co-author with them and goes back and explains it to them and says, this is what I'm going to say. Is it okay with you? And this is very much that something, again, the kind of things that jog my memory. I gave a paper at a conference on Zoom about 1.5 years ago with my research associate, Father Rino Bonvini. And what he did was because we were talking about the indigenous Pitaguari, and he brought along a couple of them and he said, well, look, I don't have to speak for them. They can speak for themselves. They did, and all he did was provide the translation. And we could do that a lot more often and make the people we do research part of our research and part of the presentation of that research. It's not going to get any more non-anthropologists to read what we write and to listen to us, but at least this is what we believe in doing, and we can do more of that.
completely agree. Yeah.
I think that's a very nice note to end it all on. I'm sending in the chat, by the way, my email. So if you do want to get a link to this particular recording really, really quickly, just shoot me an email and let me know, and I will be glad to provide it to you. I'm going to stop the recording.
And send me that Aldous Huxley reference.
Okay.
Yeah.
So